under the silver mines of Virginia City, Nevada, in the 1870s, the miners hit something that no amount of money could simply dig through. It was not rock, it was water, scalding hot water, welling up out of the deep workings, and with it a heat so fierce that a man could swing a pick for only a few minutes before he had to be hauled back up toward the surface to keep from collapsing. The richest silver mines in America were drowning and cooking at the same time, and so a stubborn immigrant named Adolph Sutro proposed to fix it the hard way. He would drive a tunnel nearly 4 miles through solid rock from a river valley far below the city up into the heart of the mines, so the hot water could run out of the mountain by gravity and cool air could run in. It took him 9 years and a war with the most powerful men in the West, and by the time he finally broke through, the silver was already running out. I have been reading the engineering records of the Comstock lode and the story of the Sutro Tunnel, and as always I want to begin with the two names that matter most, and to be clear that this is a story about engineering, not about the silver. The riches of the Comstock are famous. What I want to show you is the far less famous problem of how you keep a mine that deep from killing the men and the two men who answered it. The first is Adolf Sutro. Sutro was a German Jewish immigrant, born in Prussia in 1830, who came to America in the Great Wave of the 1840s and reached California by way of the gold rush. He made his way to Virginia City around 1860, just as the Comstock was becoming the greatest silver strike in the country, and where other men saw a fortune in the ore, Sutro saw the problem that would eventually choke the whole district, water and the heat in the deep mines, and he conceived the tunnel that would drain it. He was not a trained engineer in the modern sense. He was a driven, self-taught, relentless man with one enormous idea, and he would spend the best years of his life forcing that idea into existence, fierce opposition. What set Sutro apart was not technical genius so much as a kind of unstoppable conviction. He had taught himself engineering and mineralogy. He understood the Comstock's water problem better than almost anyone, and once he had seized on the tunnel as the answer, he simply would not let it go. Year after year, through defeat after defeat, he wrote pamphlets, he lobbied Congress, he argued his case to anyone who would listen, and he crossed the Atlantic to raise money in Europe when American capital was closed to him. He had a promoter's gift for making people believe, and an engineer's stubborn certainty that the physics were on his side. It is the kind of single-minded drive that is exhausting to be near, and that occasionally changes the world, and in Sutro's case, it did both. The second name is Philip Diedesheimer. To understand the Comstock at all, you have to understand Diedesheimer, because he solved the first great problem of those mines, the problem of how to hold them up. Diedesheimer was a German-born mining engineer, trained at the famous Freiburg Mining Academy in Europe, who came to the Comstock around 1860. The ore bodies of the Comstock were unlike anything American miners had seen, enormous and soft and crumbling, so wide that the usual way of timbering a mine simply could not span them. Diedesheimer's answer, worked out in 1860, was an idea of beautiful simplicity called square-set timbering, and it changed mining across the world. These two men are our anchors, Diedesheimer, who figured out how to hold the great mines open, Sutro, who figured out how to drain them, and below them both, as always, were the 1,000 men who actually swung the picks in the heat, whose names the record did not keep. It is worth understanding what the Comstock was, because it was the richest thing of its kind in the country. Discovered in 1859 on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, Comstock lode was an enormous deposit of silver and gold, the first great silver strike in American history, and it set off a rush that built Virginia City almost overnight into one of the most important towns in the West, a city perched on the side of a mountain and sitting on top of a fortune. The wealth that poured out of it helped build San Francisco. The Comstock's riches did not lie in a tidy vein near the surface. They ran deep, and the deeper the miners chased them, worse the conditions became, until the mines of the Comstock were among the deepest and most dangerous in the world. The silver was real. Getting it out was a fight against the mountain itself. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Let me start with Diedesheimer's problem because it comes first and it sets up everything else. When the miners followed the Comstock silver down into the earth, they found that the ore lay in bodies far too large and too weak to hold their own roofs. Dig out a chamber that big in that soft ground with ordinary timbering, and the mountain would simply close back in and crush it, and the men in it. Diedesheimer's solution was to build the support out of standardized timber cubes, heavy squared timbers framed together into open boxes, what he called square sets, each one interlocking with the next. The miners could stack these timber cubes in every direction, up, down, and sideways, following the ore wherever it went, in a kind of timber honeycomb that filled the space they had dug and held the mountain back. When a set was no longer needed to work, pack it solid with waste rock to make a pillar. With sket timbering, Comstock mines could be hollowed out into vast underground chambers, hundreds of feet high, and not collapse. It made the deep mining of the Comstock possible at all. The idea spread almost as fast as it was understood. Within a few years, square set timbering was the standard method on the Comstock, and then in the great mines of the West, and eventually around the world, anywhere men had to dig out a large, weak ore body without bringing the roof down on themselves. It is one of those inventions so practical and so widely adopted that it becomes invisible, simply the way the thing is done. And Deidesheimer could have patented it and grown rich on a royalty from every deep mine on Earth, chose not to. He gave it away to the trade. There is a particular kind of 19th century engineer who did exactly that, who saw a good idea as something that belonged to the work rather than to the inventor. And Deidesheimer was one of them, as Sutro would be in his own way. They wanted the problem solved more than they wanted to own the solution. Deidesheimer himself, the man who gave the world the square set, did not grow rich from it, and his later life had its ups and downs the way these inventors' lives so often did. He had trained at one of the great mining schools of Europe and brought that knowledge to a raw American mining camp at exactly the moment was needed, and the honeycomb of timber he sketched out in 1860 held up not just the Comstock but mines on every continent for the next half-century. It is one of the quietly most important inventions in the history of mining, and most people have never heard the man's name. That is the fate of a great deal of real engineering. The idea outlives the inventor is forgotten, and the work goes on, holding up the mountain in the dark where no one ever sees it. And here is the detail I love. Deidesheimer never patented it. Boom. He gave the idea away, and it spread to mines all over the world and stayed the standard method for the better part of a century. That timber honeycomb came at a price that you can still read on the hills of Nevada today, which is to say you cannot, as the hills are bare. Holding up the Comstock devoured wood on a scale that is hard to imagine. The mines consumed something like 80 million board feet of timber and lumber every single year, and that timber came off the slopes of the eastern Sierra Nevada, which were stripped of their forests for 50 or 60 miles around. A writer of the time put it perfectly, calling the Comstock lode the tomb of the forests of the Sierra. That line is worth sitting with, because it names one of the hidden costs of the whole Silver Age. We picture a mine as a hole in the ground. Deep mine on the scale of the Comstock was also an appetite for wood that could eat a mountain range. Every one of those timber cubes, holding back the soft ground in chambers hundreds of feet high, was cut from a living tree somewhere on the Sierra slopes, hauled to the mines, and buried in the earth, packed with waste rock and left. The forests went down the shafts and did not come back. The same pattern we have seen in the pineries of Michigan and the redwoods of the coast played out here too. A great natural thing consumed at industrial speed to feed an industry that believed it would last forever, and the Comstock, for all its silver, left the eastern Sierra stripped bare for 50 miles around. The square set held up the mine, the forest paid for the timber. The silver that came out of the ground was paid for, in part, by the forests that went down into it, swallowed as the square set timbers that kept the mountain from closing on the miners. That is the world Adolphe Sutro was working in, mountain full of soft ore, held open by a fortune in timber, and filling steadily with hot water. And the water and the heat were no small thing. The deeper the mines went, the hotter they got, because they were reaching down toward the natural heat of the earth, and the Comstock ran unusually hot. In the deepest workings, the rock and the water could reach 140 degrees, hot enough that the air was a furnace, and the seeping water would scald a careless man. Men worked nearly naked in those depths, in spells of only a few minutes, and the companies actually sent tons of ice down the shafts to cool the workings enough to be survivable. An almost unbelievable picture, hauling ice down into a mine to keep the miners alive, and the water rose as fast as they could fight it. The companies ran enormous, costly pumps day and night just to keep the lower levels from drowning, and even then the deepest mines were always on the edge of being lost to the flood. Heat from below, water from below, fortune in silver locked between them. That was the trap the Comstock had become by the time Sutro proposed his way out of it. To work those mines, men were lowered hundreds and then thousands of feet down vertical shafts in iron cages, dropping out of the dry desert air into the wet heat below, where they labored in the steam and the dark and were then hauled back up to recover. It was some of the most dangerous and brutal work in America. and the city of Virginia City above was a roaring boomtown built entirely on it, one of the richest and wildest cities in the West for a couple of decades, sitting on a mountain honeycombed beneath it with the chambers the square sets held open and the water Sutro meant to drain. Above ground, fortunes and a famous newspaper and grand opera. Below ground were men working in spells of a few minutes in 140-degree heat, and the water always rising. That was the Comstock, all of it at once, the glittering town on top and the killing heat below. Now let me show you Sutro's tunnel, and join me at the boss tier while I do, for $4.99 a month, loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back into the mountain. Sutro's idea was, like the best engineering ideas, simple to state and brutal to execute. The mines were high up in the mountain at Virginia City. Below and several miles away lay the valley of the Carson River, much lower in elevation. If you drove a tunnel from the low river valley, sloping very gently upward, straight into the rock until you reached the bottom of the Comstock mines, then all the water that was flooding those mines would simply run downhill through your tunnel and out into the valley, drained away by gravity, pumps required. And the same tunnel would let airflow in, cooling and ventilating the deadly hot workings. One tunnel would solve both the flooding and the heat at a stroke. The only difficulty was that the tunnel had to be nearly 4 miles long, driven through solid rock, much of it far from any vertical shaft that could give the diggers air and a way out, and it had to be aimed so precisely that after almost 4 miles in the dark, it would meet the bottom of a particular mine. It was one of the most ambitious tunnels anyone had attempted in America, and before he could dig a foot of it, Sutro had to fight a war, because the most powerful financial interest on the Comstock did not want his tunnel built. The mines and the mills and much of the money of the district were controlled by a group centered on the Bank of California, men like William Sharon and William Ralston, who had a tight grip on the business of pumping and draining the mines and milling the ore, and who saw in Sutro's independent tunnel a threat to that control. They fought him. They used their influence to block his financing and his backing for years. And Sutro, who was nothing if not stubborn, fought back, traveling to raise money in Europe, and turning to the one group on the Comstock who had every reason to want his tunnel, the miners themselves, the men who worked and sometimes died in the flooded, scalding mines. It was a long, bitter, years-long struggle between one determined man and the great financial ring of the West, and the remarkable thing is that the one man, in the end, won. That fight is worth dwelling on because it shows that the great engineering works of this era were never just engineering, were money and power too. The Bank of California ring made much of its fortune by controlling the Comstock's mills and the draining of its mines, charging the mines for the very services Sutro's tunnel would render cheap or needless. So they had every financial reason to want his tunnel dead. They controlled banks and newspapers and politicians, turned all of it against him. Sutro's answer was to go around them, to the miners who worked in the flooded mines, to investors in Europe, and to the federal government, and simply to outlast the opposition. It took him the better part of a decade just to get the thing financed and begun. The tunnel was an engineering problem that could be solved in 9 years of digging. The politics took nearly as long as the rock did. All of it cost an immense amount of money. And exactly how much is one of the things the records cannot quite agree on, with estimates running from a couple of $1 million up to twice that and more. What is clear is that it was a fortune, raised in the teeth of the opposition of the richest men on the coast, much of it from investors in Europe and a large loan from the federal government. Sutro spent it all on a hole in the ground that everyone in power had told him was foolish, and at the end of it, the hole did precisely what he had promised it would. There is a particular kind of vindication in that, in being right about the physics when all the money is against you, and Sutro had earned every bit of it, even if the silver gave out, before he could collect the full reward. Before I tell you what it took to dig it, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one, unless enough people click, one click and then come right back. Ground was broken on the Sutro Tunnel in October of 1869, and the digging took about 9 years. For most of that time, it was some of the hardest work in America. As the tunnel pushed deeper into the mountain, the men at the face were working farther and farther from fresh air, and the heat in the rock rose as they went. Near the end, the rock itself was over 110 degrees and climbing, and the men collapsed on the job and had to be worked in short shifts and revived. They struck floods of hot water in the rock that nearly stopped them. One engineer who hit such a flood said grimly that they had been burned out, not drowned out, because the water was scalding. They drilled and blasted and mucked out the broken rock by hand and by the machinery of the day, mile after mile in the heat and the bad air and the dark. At its peak, the work employed around 1,000 men. Sutro, short of cash because of the long fight with the bank ring, paid them partly in cash and partly in shares of the tunnel that would only be worth anything if it was finished, which tells you something about how close to the edge the whole enterprise ran. And the men who did that digging, who sweated and choked and bled nearly 4 miles into a mountain, are not named in the record. No honest count even of how many died doing it. The ledger gives them no name, only a number and a daily wage, half of it in cash and half in a promise. The driving of the tunnel pushed the technology of the day to its limits. Far from the entrance, no shaft nearby to bring in fresh air, the men at the face worked in air that grew worse and hotter the deeper they went. And the tunnel had to be ventilated artificially, air forced in through long pipes, just to keep the diggers alive. They used the new power rock drills that were coming into mining, and black powder and the more powerful explosives that arrived in those years to break the rock, and they mucked it out and hauled it the long miles back to the entrance. And through all of it, the engineers had to hold their line and their grade with absolute precision, because a tunnel nearly 4 miles long, aimed at the bottom of one particular mine, cannot afford to wander. That it came out at the end only about 1.5 feet from its target, after all those miles in the dark, is one of the quiet triumphs of 19th century surveying. Same patient science of angles and levels that laid out the canals and the railroads, carried down into the heat of a mountain. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. In the summer of 1878, after nearly 9 years in the rock, the tunnel finally broke through into the Savage Mine, deep under Virginia City. By the accounts that come down to us, after almost 4 miles of digging in the dark, the tunnel met its target so accurately that it was off by something like 18 inches, which for the surveying of that era over that distance, almost unbelievable. The hot water of the Comstock now had a way out, poured down through Sutro's tunnel and ran off into the Carson River Valley, up to 4 million gallons of it a day, draining the mines that had been drowning, and cool air flowed in behind it. The engineering worked exactly as Sutro had promised it would, which makes what happened next so painful. By 1878, the great bonanza of the Comstock was already past its peak and beginning to decline. The mines that the tunnel could now drain were running out of the rich ore that had made draining them worthwhile. Sutro had spent 9 years and a fortune and the best of his energy to solve the problem perfectly, and he arrived just as the problem was starting to solve itself by the mines giving out. He was a clear-eyed man, and he read the situation, and he sold his shares in the tunnel not long after it was finished, walking away with about $1 million in profit near the top, before the decline made the tunnel nearly worthless. The tunnel was a triumph that came a little too late to be the triumph he had dreamed. There is a hard lesson in the timing of it, and Sutro of all people understood it. The Comstock had given up a colossal burst of wealth in the mid-1870s, the strike they called the Big Bonanza, and much of the deepest, hottest work had been done chasing it. By the time Sutro's tunnel finally reached the mines in 1878, the richest ore was already largely worked out, and the district was sliding into a long decline. The tunnel could now drain mines that were no longer worth draining. It is one of the cruelest things that can happen to a great engineering project. You finished perfectly and to arrive just after the need, for it has begun to pass. Sutro did not pretend otherwise. The thing was built, worked exactly as promised, and he sold his share near the top and walked away before the decline could swallow his fortune. You can call that cold, or you can call it clear-eyed, and given how hard he had fought and how late the reward had come, I am inclined to call it earned. His later life is its own kind of story. With the fortune from the tunnel, Sutro went to San Francisco and became one of its great citizens, buying up enormous tracts of the city and public attractions like the famous Sutro Baths and the Cliff House out at the ocean's edge, planting trees by the thousands, and finally serving a term as mayor of the city in the 1890s. He had come to America a poor immigrant, and he ended as a civic figure of the greatest city on the Pacific coast, and the foundation of all of it was 9 years, spent forcing a tunnel through a mountain against the will of the most powerful men in the West. Not many lives run from a flooded silver mine to the mayor's office. Sutro's did, and yet the tunnel is still there, and still doing the one thing it was built to do. More than 140 years after it was holed through, water still flows out of the mouth of the Sutro Tunnel near Dayton, draining the old mountain by gravity exactly as it was designed to, decade after decade, with no one tending it. A group of preservationists is working now to save and restore it, and you can stand at the tunnel mouth, little ghost of the town named Sutro, and watch the water of the Comstock still run out of the rock. For a long time after the mines died, tunnel and the little company town at its mouth sat in the high desert, half forgotten, the water still trickling out. In recent years, a group of preservationists, the Friends of Sutro Tunnel, has taken up the work of saving what remains, stabilizing the old tunnel mouth with its 1880s facade, restoring the surviving buildings of the town of Sutro, and sending a drone deep into the bore to see what still stands down there in the dark. It is slow and costly work, done a few feet at a time. It means the Sutro Tunnel is not quite a ghost. The mouth is still set into the hillside, the water still runs out into the Carson Valley, the very water the tunnel was dug to drain a century and a half ago, still obeying the gentle downhill grade that a stubborn immigrant laid out to save the lives of men inside a mountain. There is something fitting in the fact that the Sutro Tunnel is mostly invisible. The great works in these stories are usually things you can see and stand under. The bridge, the lighthouse, the dam. The tunnel is the opposite. Its whole achievement happens in the dark underground out of sight. A 4-mile line of careful downhill grade that does its work by simply letting water obey gravity, silently, asking nothing. You cannot photograph what it does. You can only know that the water comes out of the hillside because, miles back inside the mountain, a man once insisted that it should. Of all the kinds of engineering, the drainage tunnel may be the most selfless and the most patient. A thing built once at enormous cost and then left to work alone in the dark for a century and more. I find I admire it the more for being unseen. Deidesheimer's square-set timbering long outlived him too, standard way of holding up a deep mine for generations across the world. Neither man's great idea was patented. Simply went out into the world and did their work with the men's names attached or not, mostly not. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We remember the Comstock for its silver, for the fortunes it made and the mansions and the senators it bought. But the silver is gone, spent and scattered more than a century ago. What is still there, still working, still holding, is the engineering. The tunnel still drains the mountain. The principle of the square set still holds up mines. The fortunes vanished, and the methods endured, which I think is almost always the way of it. We name the eras after the treasure, the silver rush, the gold rush, the oil boom. But the treasure is the most temporary thing in the story. What lasts is the way somebody figured out to solve an impossible physical problem. The tunnel through the mountain, the honeycomb of timber, patient arithmetic that lets a 4-mile bore in the dark come out 18 inches from its mark. The Silver Kings are forgotten. The man who drained their mines and the man who held them up are the ones whose work is still standing. I think they have the better monument. And there is one last thing the tunnel teaches, which is that the engineering of an age outlives its economy. The men who fought Sutro to protect their profits, the bank ring with all its power, are a footnote now, their monopoly made worthless the moment the silver gave out. But Sutro's tunnel and Deidesheimer's timber sets did not depend on the silver. They were answers to permanent problems, how to drain a deep mine, and how to hold one open. And so they outlasted the thing that paid for them. Ore was the reason, the engineering was the legacy. That gap between why a thing gets built and what actually endures from it is one of the deepest patterns in all of this history, and the Comstock, with its vanished silver and its still running tunnel, is one of the clearest places in the country to stand and see it. Go to Nevada today and the silver is gone, the bonanza a century and a half spent and scattered. But the tunnel is still draining the mountain, and somewhere a deep mine is still being held open by a honeycomb of timber, framed on a principle a German engineer worked out in 1860 and away for nothing. That is what these two men actually left behind. Not silver, which never lasts, but a way through and a way to hold, which apparently do. The treasure was the reason they came. The engineering is the reason we remember. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.